I came home from grabbing lunch to find my workshop reduced to a pile of splintered wood and twisted metal, a bright yellow excavator still idling in what used to be my driveway. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, watching some guy in a hard hat casually direct a crew loading debris into a dump truck like they were cleaning up after a routine demolition. My workshop, the building I'd spent 3 years perfecting, where I restored vintage motorcycles and built custom furniture, was gone. Just gone. "What the hell's going on here?" I shouted, running toward the excavator. The guy in the hard hat turned, clipboard in hand, looking almost bored. "Sir, you need to step back. This is an active demolition site. This is my property. That was my workshop." He glanced at his clipboard, then back at me with an expression that suggested he dealt with angry homeowners daily. "Are you Keith Harrison?" "Yes, I'm Keith Harrison, and you just destroyed my building. We're operating under authorization from the Meadowbrook Estates HOA. This structure was deemed non-compliant with community standards and was ordered for removal." He said it like he was reading a script, completely detached from the fact that he'd just obliterated thousands of hours of my work. I felt my blood pressure spike. "The HOA authorized this? Nobody told me anything about tearing down my workshop." "You should have received multiple notices, sir. We don't just show up and demolish buildings." He turned away from me, speaking into a radio clip to his vest. I pulled out my phone, hands shaking with rage, and dialed the HOA office. It rang 4 times before a perky voice answered. "Meadowbrook Estates HOA. This is Jennifer speaking. How may I help you today?" "This is Keith Harrison on Willow Creek Drive. There's a demolition crew at my house right now, and they just tore down my workshop. I never authorized this, and I never received any notices." There was a pause, the sound of typing. "Mr. Harrison, let me pull up your file. One moment, please." I paced back and forth, watching the crew continue to load debris like I wasn't even there. My 1968 Triumph Bonneville had been in that workshop, my table saw, my entire tool collection, everything. "Mr. Harrison?" Jennifer came back on the line. "Yes, I see here that multiple notices were sent to your address regarding the non-compliant outbuilding on your property. The structure didn't meet HOA architectural guidelines, and after the mandatory waiting period with no response from you, the board authorized its removal." "I never got any notices." "Sir, our records show they were mailed certified to 847 Willow Creek Drive on March 15th, April 2nd, and April 23rd. "I live at 874 Willow Creek Drive. 874. More typing, a longer pause. Oh my, let me get the board president on the line. Can you hold?" Can I hold? Your crew just demolished my building." "Sir, please hold." The line switched to elevator music before I could respond. I stood there, phone pressed to my ear, staring at the ruins of my workshop while some saxophone rendition of a pop song played. The excavator had finally shut off, and the crew was taking a break, drinking water like this was just another Tuesday for them. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 minutes, a woman's voice came on the line. Sharp, authoritative, with that particular edge that suggested she was used to being in charge and didn't appreciate having her authority questioned. "Mr. Harrison, this is Deborah Jenkins, president of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA board. I understand there's been some confusion regarding the demolition at your property." "Confusion? Your people demolished my workshop because you sent notices to the wrong address." "Now, let's not get hysterical. If there was an addressing error, that's certainly unfortunate, but the structure in question was clearly in violation of our community standards. Multiple residents had complained about the eyesore." "Eyesore? It was a professionally built workshop. I had architectural plans drawn up, proper permits from the county." "County permits are separate from HOA approval, Mr. Harrison. When you purchased your home in Meadowbrook Estates, you signed the CC&Rs agreeing to abide by all community standards. That includes getting board approval for any structures. I bought this house in 2019. That workshop was already here when I moved in." Another pause. That can't be correct. Our records indicate the structure was built without authorization." "Your records are wrong. Look, I need to speak to someone in person. Your crew just destroyed my property and everything inside it, and I want answers about how you're going to fix this." Deborah's voice took on a condescending tone that made me want to reach through the phone. Mr. Harrison, I suggest you review your homeowner documents. The HOA has the legal right to remove non-compliant structures. If you have concerns about the process, you can file a formal complaint with the board and we'll review it at our next monthly meeting. Your next meeting, when is that? June 14th at 7 p.m. in the community center. I looked at my phone. It was May 30th. That's 2 weeks away. What am I supposed to do about my demolished workshop in the meantime? File your complaint in writing, email it to the HOA office, and we'll add it to the agenda. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have other matters to attend to. She hung up before I could respond. I stood there staring at my phone, then at the debris pile, then back at the demolition crew. The foreman was walking toward me again, looking sympathetic now that his job was basically done. "Look, man," he said quietly, "I'm sorry about this. We just do what we're hired to do. But if I were you, I'd take pictures of everything before we haul it away. Document it all." He was right. I started taking photos and videos, walking around the perimeter of what used to be my workshop, capturing the destruction from every angle. As I circled the debris pile, I noticed something that made my stomach drop even further. The corner of my Triumph was visible under a collapsed wall section, the chrome tank badly dented, the custom paint job I'd spent months on scratched and scraped. "Hey," I called to the crew, "I need to get some things out of this pile before you take it away." The foreman shook his head. "Sorry, can't do that. Liability issue. Once we start a demo, nobody goes into the debris until it's fully cleared and secured. Insurance won't cover it if someone gets hurt." That's my motorcycle under there, and I have thousands of dollars worth of tools in that pile. File a claim with whoever hired us. We're just contractors." He walked away, pulling out his phone. I called my insurance company next, getting bounced between 3 different departments before finally reaching someone who could help. The agent, a guy named Marcus who at least sounded sympathetic, explained that my homeowner's policy might cover the contents, but the structure itself would be complicated given that the HOA had authorized the demolition. "You'll need to file a police report," Marcus said. "Document everything. Get copies of all communication with the HOA, and definitely get a lawyer. This sounds like it's going to get messy." A lawyer? Of course. I called my buddy James, who worked as a paralegal at a civil litigation firm in downtown Denver. We'd gone to college together, stayed friends through the years, and he'd helped me navigate the legal stuff when I bought the house. "Keith, slow down," James said after I'd rapid fire explained the situation. "They demolished it today? Like, just now? I'm watching them load it into trucks as we speak. Okay. First, yes, take all the pictures. Second, file a police report for destruction of property. Third, I'm going to give you the number for my boss, Richard Chen. He specializes in property disputes and HOA cases. This is exactly his wheelhouse." "How much is this going to cost me?" "Rich usually does a free initial consultation. After that, honestly, it depends. But Keith, if what you're telling me is accurate and they demolished your building because they sent notices to the wrong address, you've got a solid case. The HOA is going to be liable for this." I thanked James and called the number he texted me. Richard Chen's office manager scheduled me for the next morning at 9. Then, I called the Denver Police Department non-emergency line and explained the situation. The dispatcher sounded confused but said she'd send an officer to take a report. Officer Patricia Mills showed up 40 minutes later, a veteran cop who'd probably seen everything in her 20 years on the force. She walked around the debris pile, took her own photos, and interviewed the demolition crew foreman. I gave her all the details, showed her the call logs and the photos I'd taken. "This is a civil matter mostly," she said, "but I'll file a report for destruction of property. You'll want this for insurance and any legal action. The thing is, Mr. Harrison, if the HOA had what they believed was proper authorization, it's going to be hard to pursue criminal charges. This is going to come down to lawyers and lawsuits. What about my stuff inside? My motorcycle? My tools? That's got to be theft, right?" "Possibly. But again, if they believed they had authorization to remove the entire structure and its contents, proving criminal intent is tough. Document everything, get appraisals, keep all your receipts if you have them." She handed me a case number and left. The demolition crew finished loading the last of the debris around 5 p.m. I stood in my driveway, staring at the empty concrete pad where my workshop had been for who knew how many years before I bought the place. The space looked wrong, like a missing tooth. My neighbor Frank came over around 6 carrying 2 beers. He was in his 60s, retired military, had lived in Meadowbrook Estate since the development opened in 2015. "Saw what happened," he said, handing me a beer. "That's rough, man. I heard the commotion but was at my daughter's this morning. Got home and saw the whole thing was just, gone." "Frank, how long has that workshop been there?" He scratched his chin, thinking. "I'd say, hell, since before I moved in. Old Mr. Patterson built it. Had to be 2014, maybe early 2015. Real craftsmanship, too. He was a carpenter, built the whole thing himself. When he sold you the house, I figured you'd keep using it the same way." "Did Patterson get HOA approval?" Approval? Keith, there wasn't really an HOA when he built it. The development was just getting started. I think the HOA wasn't officially established until late 2015, and even then, it was pretty hands-off for the first few years. Deborah Jenkins didn't take over as president until 2021, and that's when things got strict. That was useful information. I asked Frank if he'd be willing to give a statement to my lawyer, and he agreed immediately. I spent that evening going through every box in my garage, looking for my closing documents from when I bought the house. I found them in a filing cabinet around midnight. The property survey clearly showed the workshop labeled as existing outbuilding, approximately 800 square feet. The title, insurance policy. The inspection report, which had noted the workshop was in excellent condition, probably built around 2014-2015, based on materials and construction methods. And then I found something interesting in the seller's disclosures. A note from Patterson stating that the workshop had been built in 2014 with proper county permits and had been grandfathered under HOA regulations when the CC and Rs were established in 2015. I took photos of everything and emailed them to myself, then made copies for the morning meeting with Richard Chen. I barely slept. I kept thinking about the triumph, about the custom dining table I'd been building for my sister's anniversary, about the guitar I'd been restoring for my nephew. All of it just crushed and hauled away like garbage. Richard Chen's office was in a modern building on 17th Street in downtown Denver. The law firm took up the entire 8th floor, all glass walls and sleek furniture. Richard himself was in his late 40s, sharp-dressed with the kind of intense focus that made you feel like you were the only client in the world. "Mr. Harrison," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "James filled me in on the basics, but I want to hear it from you. Start from the beginning." I walked him through everything. The demolished workshop, the wrong address on the notices, my conversation with Deborah Jenkins, the documents from my home purchase showing the workshop pre-existed my ownership. Richard took notes on a legal pad, occasionally asking clarifying questions. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "This is egregious," he said. "I've handled dozens of HOA disputes, but this is one of the worst cases of overreach I've seen. They demolished a pre-existing structure based on notices sent to the wrong address, without verifying ownership or property records. The fact that your deed and survey clearly show the workshop compounds their liability." "So I have a case?" "You have an excellent case. Here's what we're going to do. First, I'm going to send a formal demand letter to the HOA board and their insurance carrier, outlining the facts and demanding immediate compensation for the demolished structure and its contents. Second, we're going to request an emergency meeting with the board before their scheduled June meeting. Third, we're going to get an independent appraisal of the workshop's value and a detailed inventory of everything that was destroyed. How much is this going to cost me? My retainer for a case like this is $5,000. However, given the strength of your case, I'm confident we'll recover my fees from the HOA as part of the settlement or judgment. I'm also willing to work on a contingency basis for anything above the base damages, meaning I take a percentage of the recovery, but you don't pay additional hourly fees. I thought about it for maybe 10 seconds. Let's do it. We spent the next 2 hours going through every detail. Richard had me write down everything I could remember that was in the workshop, every tool, every project, every piece of equipment. He requested copies of all my documents, my photos, the police report. "One more thing," Richard said as we wrapped up. "Don't communicate with the HOA directly anymore. Everything goes through me now. If Deborah Jenkins or anyone from the board contacts you, politely tell them to speak with your attorney and give them my number." I left his office feeling better than I had in 24 hours. At least I had someone fighting for me now. Richard worked fast. By that afternoon, he'd sent a formal demand letter to the HOA board via certified mail and email. He also filed a lawsuit in Denver District Court, which he explained was necessary to preserve my rights even while we attempted to negotiate. 2 days later, on Friday afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I let it go to voicemail. It was Deborah Jenkins, her voice tight with barely controlled anger. "Mr. Harrison, this is Deborah Jenkins from the HOA board. I received a highly inappropriate letter from an attorney claiming to represent you, making outrageous demands regarding the removal of your non-compliant structure. I need to speak with you immediately about this matter before it escalates further. Call me back at..." I deleted it and texted Richard the details. He responded immediately, "Perfect. Don't engage. Let her stew." The following Monday, I met with an appraiser Richard had recommended, a guy named Tom who specialized in custom structures and workshop spaces. We spent 3 hours going over my photos, my original plans, and comparable structures in the area. "Based on materials, square footage, and the quality of construction visible in your photos," Tom said, "I'd appraise the replacement value of this workshop at approximately $85,000. That's conservative. If you had high-end finishes or specialized electrical for your equipment, it could be higher." "And the contents?" "That's harder without receipts, but I can give you a baseline estimate based on what you've described and market values for those items. The vintage motorcycle alone, depending on condition, could be $20,000 to $30,000. Professional grade tools, ongoing projects, materials, you're looking at another $60,000 to $70,000 at minimum." I felt sick. I'd known the dollar amount would be high, but hearing it out loud made the loss feel even more real. Richard used Tom's preliminary numbers in a second letter to the HOA, this time CCing their insurance company and demanding an emergency board meeting. He also sent a letter to the demolition company, putting them on notice that they might be liable as well for failing to verify the property address. On Wednesday, June 5th, I got an email from the HOA's attorney, a woman named Susan Carlisle. It was formal, cold, and basically argued that the HOA had followed proper procedures, that I should have been aware of the CC and RS, and that the structure was non-compliant regardless of when it was built. Richard responded the same day, shredding her arguments point by point. He attached copies of my deed, the survey, Patterson's disclosure, and Frank's written statement about the workshop's history. He also pointed out that even if the workshop had been non-compliant, the notices sent to the wrong address invalidated the entire process. The back and forth continued for days. Each exchange escalated the tension. Susan Carlisle tried to argue that the workshop was an eyesore and a safety hazard. Richard countered with photos I'd taken showing it was well-maintained and professionally constructed. She claimed multiple residents had complained. Richard demanded to see the complaints and the HOA's records of addressing them. Finally, on June 10th, Susan Carlisle sent an email proposing a settlement meeting. The HOA board would meet with me and Richard on June 12th, 4 days before their regularly scheduled meeting, to discuss potential resolution options. Richard and I prepared like we were going to trial. He coached me on staying calm, on not engaging with Deborah's inevitable provocations, on sticking to the facts. We put together a presentation with photos, documents, and appraisals, laying out exactly what the HOA had destroyed and what they owed me. The meeting was held in the Meadowbrook Estates Community Center, a bland building with conference rooms and a small gym. The HOA board consisted of 5 people: Deborah Jenkins, a thin woman in her early 50s with severe blonde hair and the kind of pinched expression that suggested she spent most of her time finding things to disapprove of; Martin Reynolds, the vice president, a nervous accountant type who barely made eye contact; Sandra Kim, the treasurer, who looked like she wished she was anywhere else; Robert Walsh, who owned a car dealership and had the aggressive handshake of a salesman; and Patricia Dunn, the secretary, a retired teacher who seemed to be the only reasonable person in the room. Susan Carlisle sat at the end of the table, her laptop open, legal pad stacked next to her. Deborah started the meeting before Richard or I had even fully sat down. "I want to state for the record that this meeting is a courtesy." The HOA maintains that we acted within our legal rights and authority in removing the non-compliant structure from Mr. Harrison's property. Richard didn't miss a beat, and I want to state for the record that your client demolished my client's legally permitted pre-existing structure after sending notices to the wrong address, resulting in damages exceeding $150,000. We're here to discuss how you're going to make this right, not to debate whether you have liability. Your liability is clear. Deborah's face flushed. The structure was not permitted by the HOA. The structure predates the HOA's authority over that portion of the property, Richard interrupted, sliding a document across the table. This is the original survey from when Meadowbrook Estates was platted. You'll note that Mr. Harrison's lot, along with lots 42 through 51, were part of the first phase of development. The workshop was built in 2014, before the CC and RS were finalized and recorded. It was grandfathered. Susan Carlyle picked up the document, studied it, then whispered something to Deborah. Martin Reynolds looked like he might throw up. Furthermore, Richard continued, even if the structure had required HOA approval, which it didn't, your process was fatally flawed. You sent notices to 847 Willow Creek Drive. My client lives at 874 Willow Creek Drive. You demolished his property without ever confirming that he'd received notice or had an opportunity to respond. That's not just negligence. In this case, it's willful destruction of property. The addressing error was an honest mistake, Susan Carlyle said. An honest mistake that cost my client his workshop and over $100,000 in property and equipment. The law doesn't care if your negligence was honest or not. The meeting went on for 2 hours. Deborah tried to argue that I should have been more involved with the HOA, that I should have known about the architectural guidelines. Richard countered that the guidelines didn't apply to pre-existing structures and that the HOA's own bylaws required actual notice before taking action. Robert Walsh, the car dealer, finally spoke up. Look, what's it going to take to make this go away? Our insurance company is already breathing down our necks about this. Full replacement of the workshop to original specifications, Richard said. Reimbursement for all contents, including the vintage motorcycle tools and projects. Compensation for emotional distress and the inconvenience of being without his workspace for the duration of reconstruction. And coverage of all legal fees incurred to date. That's outrageous, Deborah snapped. What's outrageous is demolishing someone's building without proper notice, Richard replied calmly. My client is willing to be reasonable, but he's not going to accept pennies on the dollar for what you destroyed. Patricia Dunn, the retired teacher, cleared her throat. May I say something? Everyone turned to her. I wasn't on the board when the demolition was authorized. I joined just last month. But looking at these documents, it seems pretty clear that we made a serious mistake. Multiple mistakes, actually. Maybe instead of fighting this, we should focus on making it right. Deborah glared at her. Patricia, you don't understand the full history. I understand that we tore down this man's workshop because we sent letters to the wrong house. That's pretty straightforward. Sandra Kim, the treasurer, nodded slowly. Our insurance premiums are going to go through the roof if this turns into a prolonged lawsuit, and if we lose, which it sounds like we probably would, we might have to levy a special assessment on all the homeowners to cover the costs. That got everyone's attention. Nothing motivated an HOA board faster than the threat of angry homeowners facing unexpected fees. Susan Carlyle called for a recess. The board members and their attorney huddled in the corner, whispering intensely. Richard and I waited, drinking terrible coffee from the community center's machine. After 20 minutes, they came back to the table. Susan Carlyle spoke first. Mr. Harrison, the board is prepared to offer a settlement. We will cover the full cost of rebuilding the workshop to the specifications shown in your original photos and survey. We will reimburse you for the contents based on the appraisal Mr. Chen provided, subject to verification of the values, and we will cover your legal fees to date. What about compensation for being without my workspace? I asked. We can offer an additional $10,000 for inconvenience and to expedite construction. Richard looked at me. We'd discussed this possibility. It wasn't everything we could probably get if we went to trial, but it was substantial, and it would get my workshop back faster than a years-long court battle. I want it in writing, I said. a full settlement agreement signed by every board member with a timeline for construction and payment. "We can have the agreement drafted by end of business Friday," Susan Carlyle said. "I want approval rights on the contractor and the plans," I added. "This is going to be built right, not rushed by some low-bid contractor who cuts corners." Deborah looked like she wanted to argue, but Susan put a hand on her arm. "That's reasonable. We can work with you on contractor selection." We shook hands, though Deborah's grip was limp and her expression suggested she'd rather be shaking hands with a rattlesnake. Richard and I left the community center, and I felt like I could breathe fully for the first time in 2 weeks. "That went better than I expected," Richard said in the parking lot. "I thought we'd need at least 2 or 3 meetings to get them to the table on real numbers." "What's the catch?" "No catch necessarily, but we need to make sure the settlement agreement is airtight. I've seen HOAs try to wiggle out of commitments. We'll review every word before you sign." The settlement agreement arrived the following Tuesday, June 18th. It was 32 pages of legal language, but the core terms were solid. The HOA would pay for complete reconstruction of the workshop up to $100,000. They'd reimburse me $85,000 for contents based on Tom's appraisal, with payment within 30 days. They'd pay Richard's legal fees, which had hit $12,000 by that point, and they'd pay me $10,000 for inconvenience, also within 30 days. In exchange, I would release them from all claims related to the demolition and agree not to sue the demolition company or any individual board members. Richard made a few tweaks to protect my interests, particularly around the timeline for reconstruction and my approval rights on the contractor. Susan Carlyle accepted the changes with minimal pushback. By June 25th, we had a fully executed settlement agreement. The first check, for $95,000 covering contents and inconvenience, arrived on July 2nd. I deposited it immediately and started the painful process of replacing what I'd lost. The Triumph was going to be the hardest. I'd bought that bike as a basket case in 2020 and had spent years tracking down original parts, doing the restoration myself. You can't just replace that kind of work. The HOA hired a contractor recommended by Richard, a builder named Scott Martinez, who specialized in custom workshops and outbuildings. Scott came out to my property in mid-July to walk through the plans. "I've worked on a lot of HOA-related projects," Scott said, looking at the photos of my original workshop. "Usually it's homeowners adding something new. This is the first time I've had to rebuild something the HOA demolished." "Welcome to my life," Scott laughed. "Well, good news is this is totally doable. Based on your photos and the survey, I can recreate this almost exactly. The even better news is that building codes have changed since 2014, so we can actually improve on some things. Better insulation, more efficient electrical, upgraded HVAC if you want it." "How long will it take?" "Permitting will take maybe 3 weeks. Construction, probably 6 to 8 weeks after that, depending on weather and material availability. So you're looking at having your workshop back by late October, early November." That was faster than I'd expected. We went through the plans in detail. I wanted to maintain the same exterior appearance as the original, but Scott's suggestions for interior improvements made sense. Better lighting, more outlets, an upgraded ventilation system for when I was painting or working with finishes. The county issued the building permit on August 8th. Scott's crew broke ground on August 15th, starting with the foundation and framing. I stopped by the site every day after work, watching the workshop take shape. It was satisfying in a way, seeing it rise from nothing, even though I'd rather have just kept the original. While construction progressed, I focused on replacing my equipment. I found another Triumph Bonneville, a 1969 this time, in rough shape but complete. Not the same as the one I'd lost, but a new project to throw myself into. I restocked my tools gradually, haunting estate sales and equipment auctions, finding deals where I could. The neighborhood's reaction to the whole situation was interesting. Most people were sympathetic, especially once word spread about how the demolition had happened. A few neighbors I barely knew stopped by to express their support. Frank told me that there had been a lot of angry discussion at the regular HOA meeting in July, with several homeowners demanding to know how the board had let the situation get so out of hand. Deborah Jenkins, predictably, had tried to spin it as much ado about nothing, claiming the settlement proved the HOA was reasonable and responsive to homeowner concerns. But according to Frank, who attended every meeting. At least a dozen residents had stood up to challenge her, pointing out that being reasonable would have meant not demolishing the workshop in the first place. "There's talk of a recall election," Frank told me in early September. "A lot of people are tired of Deborah's power trips. This situation with your workshop was just the most visible example, but she's been causing problems for years. Fines for lawns that are a quarter-inch too long, violations for Christmas lights left up one day past the deadline, that kind of petty stuff." "A recall election would have to be called by the board, wouldn't it?" "Nope. The CC and Rs allow homeowners to petition for a special election. You need signatures from 20% of the homeowners. There are 280 homes in Meadowbrook Estates, so that's 56 signatures. Last I heard, they were up to 90. I didn't get involved in the recall effort, but I won't lie. The idea of Deborah getting voted out gave me a certain satisfaction. Scott's crew made excellent progress through September. The framing went up, the roof went on, and by late September, they were working on electrical and insulation. I'd stop by after work and see Scott or one of his guys, and we'd talk through details. What kind of finish on the concrete floor? Where to position the outlets? Whether to add a small bathroom, which hadn't been in the original but would be a nice upgrade. "The HOA's paying for it," Scott said with a grin. "Might as well make it everything you want." I approved the bathroom addition, and a better heating system, and premium insulation. Every upgrade I requested, Scott submitted to the HOA for approval, citing various building codes and efficiency standards. Susan Carlisle approved them all without question. I suspected the HOA's insurance company had made it very clear that keeping me happy was worth a lot more than nickel and diming over upgrades. The recall election happened on October 3rd. It wasn't even close. Deborah Jenkins was removed as president by a vote of 182 to 47. The board was required to hold a new election for president within 30 days. Patricia Dunn, the retired teacher who'd been the voice of reason during the settlement meeting, ran unopposed and won easily. Frank told me that Deborah had shown up to the meeting where the results were announced, tried to give a speech about how she'd been targeted unfairly, and was booed by half the room. She'd resigned from the board entirely the next day. "Good riddance," Frank said. 20 years in the military, I've seen a lot of petty tyrants. She was right up there with the worst of them." My new workshop was completed on October 28th, almost exactly 5 months after the original had been demolished. Scott did a final walkthrough with me, pointing out all the features, making sure everything was to my satisfaction. It was beautiful, better than the original in a lot of ways. The same footprint and exterior appearance, but with modern insulation, LED lighting, a state-of-the-art electrical system, the new bathroom, and a heating and cooling system that would let me work comfortably year-round. The concrete floor had a polished finish that was easy to clean. Scott had even added some custom touches, like a pegboard wall system for tools and a dedicated space for my welding equipment with proper ventilation. "I almost feel bad that the original got demolished," I joked. "This is incredible." Scott smiled. "Well, don't feel too bad. The HOA paid me about $40,000 more than the original would have cost to build, thanks to all the upgrades and rush fees. And you got a better workshop out of it. Win-win." The final cost, according to the invoice Scott submitted to the HOA, was $138,000. The original settlement capped the HOA's obligation at $100,000 for the workshop itself. But with the additional upgrades I'd requested and they'd approved, they were on the hook for the full amount. I heard through Frank that there'd been an emergency board meeting when the final invoice came in. The insurance company had covered the original settlement, but the overages came out of the HOA's reserve fund. Patricia Dunn had apparently told the other board members that it was a cheap lesson in not demolishing people's property without proper notice. I moved my equipment into the new workshop over the course of a week. The new Triumph found a home on a dedicated lift. My tools, old and new, filled the cabinets and pegboard walls. I set up my workbench, my table saw, my welding rig. By early November, I was back to working on projects, and it felt good to have a space again. On November 15th, I got a letter from Patricia Dunn, writing in her capacity as HOA president. It was refreshingly straightforward. "Dear Mr. Harrison, on behalf of the Meadowbrook Estates HOA Board of Directors, I want to formally apologize for the demolition of your workshop and the distress it caused you. The previous board's handling of this matter was unacceptable, and we have implemented new procedures to ensure nothing like this happens to any homeowner in our community again. All violation notices must now be hand-delivered with photographic confirmation of the address. No demolition or major remediation actions can be authorized without an in-person site visit by at least 2 board members. And we have established a homeowner appeals process for anyone who receives a violation notice. I hope your new workshop serves you well for many years to come. If you have any concerns or suggestions for how we can better serve the community, please don't hesitate to reach out. Sincerely, Patricia Dunn, President, Meadowbrook Estates HOA. I appreciated the letter. Appreciated. It felt genuine, unlike the corporate non-apology I'd expected. Life settled back into a rhythm. I worked on the Triumph in the evenings and on weekends. I started taking on commission work again, building custom furniture for people who'd heard about my stuff through word of mouth. The new workshop's improved ventilation and climate control made finishing work so much easier. In early December, Frank came over with a bottle of bourbon to celebrate the workshop's completion. We sat in my new space, heat cranked up against the Colorado winter, admiring the setup. "You know," Frank said, "when I saw them tearing down your workshop back in May, I thought you were screwed. HOAs have so much power, and fighting them usually just drains your bank account and your sanity." "I got lucky with Richard," I said, "and lucky that the case was so clear-cut. If they'd sent those notices to the right address, even if the workshop was grandfathered, fighting it would have been a lot harder. Still, you stood up for yourself. A lot of people would have just accepted it, figured it wasn't worth the fight, and look what you got for not backing down." He had a point. The new workshop wasn't just about the building. It was about not letting Deborah Jenkins and her petty tyranny go unchallenged. It was about holding the HOA accountable for their mistakes. We toasted to that, and to good neighbors, and to workshops that don't get demolished. The final chapter in the saga came in January 2025. I got a notice from Richard Chen that the HOA's insurance company had settled with the demolition contractor for failing to verify the property address before beginning work. The settlement amount was confidential, but Richard told me it was substantial enough that the contractor had implemented new verification procedures for all their jobs. "Your case is actually being used as a training example now," Richard said when we met for lunch to close out the file. "I've had 3 other attorneys contact me about HOA demolition cases in the past few months, all referencing what happened to you." "Is that common? HOAs just demolishing stuff?" "More common than you'd think. Usually it's sheds or fences or landscaping features, not whole workshops. But HOAs have broad authority under most CC&Rs, and some boards abuse that authority. They count on homeowners not having the resources or knowledge to fight back." "Well, glad my disaster can help someone else," Richard smiled. "You did good, Keith. A lot of clients would have taken the first lowball offer just to be done with it. You stood firm, and you got what you deserved." We wrapped up the last of the paperwork. The final accounting showed that the total cost to the HOA, between the settlement, legal fees, construction overages, and their own attorney costs, was somewhere north of $250,000, all because they'd sent notices to 847 instead of 874. I framed the original police report and hung it in my workshop, right next to a photo of the demolition crew loading the debris. A reminder of how things can go wrong fast and how important it is to stand up for yourself when they do. The Triumph restoration wrapped up in March 2025. It wasn't the same bike I'd lost, but it was a good bike, and I'd put my own work into it. I took it for its first real ride on a warm Saturday in early April, cruising through the foothills west of Denver, enjoying the sound of the engine and the feel of the road. When I got back home, I pulled into my driveway and just sat there for a minute, looking at the workshop. Solid, well-built, full of light and warmth in the tools of my trade. It had cost the HOA a fortune and me 6 months of stress and frustration. But it was mine, and no one was going to take it away again. Frank came out of his house, waved, walked over to admire the bike. "Looking good," he said. "Both the bike and the shop." "Thanks, been a long road." "Worth it though, right?" I thought about it. The anger and frustration of that first day, coming home to find my workshop demolished. The grinding stress of the legal battle, even though Richard had done most of the heavy lifting. The months of waiting for construction, of replacing irreplaceable things, but also the satisfaction of holding the HOA accountable. The improvement in the neighborhood's governance with Patricia Dunn as president, the upgraded workshop that was objectively better than what I'd lost, and the knowledge that I'd fought for what was right and won. Yeah, I said, worth it. The story could have ended there, but there was one more twist. In late April, I got a call from a reporter at the Denver Post. Someone had tipped them off about the case, and they wanted to do a story about HOA overreach and homeowner rights. I was hesitant at first. The legal battle was over, I had my workshop back, and I didn't particularly want to relive the whole thing for a newspaper article. But Richard encouraged me to do it. Stories like yours need to be told, he said. HOAs operate in the shadows most of the time. The more people know about how these things can go wrong, the better chance we have of reforming the system. I agreed to the interview. The reporter, a woman named Sarah Chen, no relation to Richard, came to my house and spent 2 hours talking to me about everything that had happened. She interviewed Frank, got statements from Patricia Dunn and the HOA, and even tracked down Deborah Jenkins, who apparently refused to comment. The article ran on the front page of the Metro section on May 4th, 2025. HOA demolished his workshop by mistake. Now he has a better one and they have a $250,000 bill. It was fair and accurate, detailing the addressing error, the demolition, the legal battle, and the settlement. It included photos of the debris pile and the completed new workshop, and it sparked a surprising amount of discussion. The comment section on the Post's website filled up with people sharing their own HOA horror stories. Several state legislators contacted me about potentially sponsoring legislation to reform HOA practices in Colorado. A local TV news station did a follow-up piece, interviewing me in my workshop surrounded by my tools and the triumph. For about 2 weeks, I was the poster child for HOA reform. It was weird and uncomfortable and more attention than I'd ever wanted. But if it helped prevent what happened to me from happening to someone else, I figured it was worth the awkwardness. By June, the media attention had died down and life went back to normal. I worked on projects in my workshop. I rode the Triumph on weekends. I went to the occasional HOA meeting just to stay informed and was pleasantly surprised by how reasonable Patricia Dunn and the new board were. They'd instituted all the reforms Patricia had promised in her letter. Violation notices were hand-delivered with photo proof. Major actions required board votes and site visits. Homeowners had a real appeals process. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was a hell of a lot better than Deborah Jenkins's reign of petty tyranny. On the anniversary of the demolition, May 30th, 2026, I held a workshop open house. I invited the neighbors, Richard Chen, Scott Martinez and his crew, Patricia Dunn, and anyone else who'd been part of the saga. About 40 people showed up, which was more than I'd expected. We grilled burgers, drank beer, and celebrated the workshop. People admired the craftsmanship, checked out the Triumph, and swapped stories about their own HOA battles. Frank gave a toast about standing up for yourself and holding power accountable. Patricia Dunn gave a short speech about learning from mistakes and improving the community. It was a good day. A year earlier, I'd stood in my driveway watching my workshop get reduced to rubble, feeling helpless and angry. Now I was surrounded by friends and neighbors in a better workshop than I'd had before, having proven that you could fight City Hall, or in this case, the HOA, and win. As the party wound down and people started heading home, I stood in the workshop doorway, looking at the space. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the workbenches and the tools and the Triumph in all its restored glory. Richard Chen came up beside me, beer in hand. You ever regret it? The fight, I mean. It would have been easier to just accept a small settlement and move on. I thought about it. The stress, the time, the emotional energy it had all taken. But then I thought about what I would have felt like if I'd just rolled over, if I'd let Deborah Jenkins and the HOA get away with demolishing my property because they couldn't be bothered to verify an address. No regrets, I said. They demolished my workshop, found my deed that proved it was legal and grandfathered, and now they owe me a brand new building. Better than new, actually. I'd say that's justice. Richard raised his beer. To justice, then, and to not backing down. We clinked bottles and stood there in comfortable silence, enjoying the moment. My workshop was back, better than ever. The HOA had learned an expensive lesson about accountability, and I'd learned that sometimes fighting the system, as exhausting and frustrating as it can be, is worth it. The workshop still stands today, a testament to the importance of proper documentation, the value of standing up for your rights, and the high cost of institutional arrogance. Every time I walk into it, fire up a power tool, or work on a restoration project, I remember that day in May when it was all reduced to rubble, and how far I've come since then. It's more than just a building. It's a reminder that you don't have to accept injustice, that systems can be held accountable, and that sometimes the fight is worth it even when it seems impossible. And if there's ever another addressing error, another violation notice, another overreach by the powers that be, well, I know exactly who to call. My lawyer has my workshop's correct address on file, double-checked and verified. 874 Willow Creek Drive, Meadowbrook Estates, Denver, Colorado. Not 847, never 847 again.